Chosen one, the noise of the world has been silenced for this moment. You may not hear it with your physical ears, but heaven has pressed pause on the chaos around you because there is something God wants to say directly to you. You are here, not by accident, but by divine appointment. Picture this late at night. A man sits alone in a dimly lit room. The clock ticks slowly, his phone face down. The world outside continuing without him. His name is Eli, though heaven calls him differently. Marked 1. Eli has been waiting for a breakthrough that seemed like it would never come. Friends have moved on. Prayers have gone unanswered. And somewhere in the shadows, he's begun to wonder if God still sees him. But tonight, in that silence, something happens. A stillness, heavier than the air, settles over the room. A whisper breaks through. Not with thunder, but with weight. I've changed my mind about you. It was not because God suddenly learned something new about Eli. No, it was because heaven had been watching. Watching when Eli held on in the moments others would have let go. Watching when he said yes to obedience that no one clapped for. Watching when, in his deepest loneliness, he still refused to betray the one who called him. You see, God's change of mind is not a correction of his knowledge, it's the manifestation of his timing. We are reminded through the words of David in the Psalms. Chapter 18, verse 33. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He causes me to stand on the heights. Perhaps you, too, have been living in your own appointed time season. That season where the doors didn't just stay shut, they seemed welded closed. Where prayers felt like they bounced back down from the ceiling. Where you saw others stepping into blessings while you stood on the sidelines wondering if heaven had misplaced your file. But tonight, I tell you, the pause is over. God says, I have changed my mind about you. And the meaning is this: what was withheld will now be released. What was delayed will now be accelerated. And what was hidden will now be revealed. Eli didn't know that his long wait had been a test of endurance and a refining of faith, like gold in a furnace. The heat had not been to destroy him, but to burn away the things that couldn't enter his next season. The refining was not punishment, it was preparation. And perhaps your waiting season has been the same. The thing about heaven's pause is that it's never wasted. Even when you feel overlooked, God is doing the deep, hidden work that makes your breakthrough sustainable. If you rush into it before the time, the blessing can crush you. But if you allow God to work in the unseen, then when the shift comes, you are ready to stand under the weight of glory. Eli didn't receive his change in a dramatic way. There was no lightning in the sky, no trumpet blast. It began with a whisper and was confirmed by a shift in his spirit, a sudden peace, a knowing that the chapter had turned. And you, chosen one, may feel it in the same quiet way. You might wake tomorrow with no obvious sign, but something in you will know that heaven's stance toward you has shifted. That's why I'm speaking this to you right now. Do not despise the day of small beginnings. The change of mind from heaven doesn't always begin with fireworks. It begins with an announcement. And this moment, right now, is your announcement. So I invite you, if you can feel this message echoing in your spirit, do something simple but powerful. Let the world know you heard heaven today. Like this message as your public Amen. Share it so that another waiting soul might realize their pause is about to end. And in the comments, type the number 14, marking Exodus 14:14 as your declaration that the Lord himself is fighting for you. The story of Eli is still unfolding, just as yours is. He didn't just receive a word, he started walking differently the next day. The shift inside him became a shift in how he spoke, how he prayed, and how he looked at tomorrow. And I believe you will see the same, because when heaven changes its mind about you, everything changes. And when it changes, the change is permanent. No power of darkness can reverse it. No opinion of man can cancel it. And no delay can undo what God has already set in motion for you. You've survived what should have destroyed you. There are moments in life that feel like the end moments, when the weight pressing on your chest makes it hard to breathe, when the night feels endless, when your heart whispers, "This is it, I can't come back from this." You know those moments, because you've been there, and yet you are still here. That in itself is a miracle that heaven has not overlooked. Eli knew this valley well. Long before the whisper of God's changed mind, he had walked through a season so dark it felt like the sun had forgotten him. His closest companion had betrayed him. His savings were gone, and sickness visited his body like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind looping the same question over and over. Why let me live through this if it's only going to break me? But God was watching, even in Eli's frailty, even in his anger and confusion. Something deep inside him refused to let go. He didn't have the strength to stand tall, but he had just enough faith to crawl forward. That was enough for heaven to notice. The Spirit spoke through the prophet Micah, chapter 7, verse 8. Though I have fallen, I will rise. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. Your survival is not an accident. Every tear you cried, every breath you took when it felt easier to stop, every morning you forced yourself out of bed when your heart begged you to stay down, those were victories in heaven's eyes. Storms are selective. The same wind and waves that swallow some will carry others to shore. And the only reason you made it here is because God placed his hand over your life and said, "Not yet." The enemy wanted to write your ending in the middle of the book, but heaven rewrote the script. Eli's darkest night came in the form of a hospital room. Machines beeped in rhythm with his shallow breaths. Somewhere between the beeping and the silence, a strange peace slipped in. It didn't take away the pain, but it told him, "You will walk out of here." And he did. Weeks later, he stood outside in the sunlight, blinking like someone seeing the world for the first time again. Some think survival means you weren't touched by the fire, but it means you were touched, yet not consumed, like a clay jar passing through a furnace. You came out harder in some places, more beautiful in others. That's why heaven's change of mind toward you is profound, because you proved you could endure without collapsing. You are like a bridge that has stood through earthquakes, not because it never shook, but because its foundation went deeper than the tremors could reach. God doesn't just see a survivor, he sees a warrior tempered in battle. That authority cannot be faked. It's forged only in fire. You've survived betrayals that could have made you bitter, losses that could have left you empty, seasons that could have turned you away from God entirely. Survival was never the end. It was the setup for the glory coming next. Eli once said, "I didn't survive because I'm strong. I survived because God refused to let me die in the middle of my story." That's the truth you need to carry today. no matter what came against you. It failed, not because it wasn't strong enough, but because God's plan is still unfolding. When heaven says the story continues, nothing can write your final chapter. And perhaps that is why you are being prepared for the next season with such care. You are not the same person who first entered the valley. You carry a depth you didn't have before. Your prayers are weightier now, not because they are louder, but because they come from a heart that has been broken and remade by the potter's hands. The storms you have passed through have sharpened your vision. You now recognize false peace when you see it. You can smell deception in the wind before the storm arrives. These are not just survival instincts, they are gifts, forged in the place where God walked beside you, while others saw only darkness. The world may see scars, heaven sees inscriptions, marks of ownership, proof that you belong to the one who would not let you go. And when the trumpet of your new season sounds, those marks will shine. Your hidden obedience in secret places. There are acts of faith that make headlines, public victories, testimonies shared from platforms, breakthroughs witnessed by crowds. And then there are the quiet ones, the unseen decisions you make when no one is watching, when there is no applause, when it costs you something but brings you no recognition. Those are the seeds heaven treasures most. Eli's turning point didn't come from a stage. It came one cold winter evening when he found himself at a grocery store, watching a stranger at the checkout line struggle to pay. He had just enough money in his account to buy what he needed for the week. He also had a choice to pretend not to notice or to step in. No one would know. No one would thank him. But he reached into his pocket, covered the bill, and walked away without even giving his name. That moment never made it to social media, but it made it to heaven's record, because obedience in public might inspire others, but obedience in private moves the heart of God. According to what is revealed in the book of Proverbs, chapter 15, verse 3, the eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. And you have moments like this in your own story. Times when you kept quiet instead of defending yourself. Not because you were weak, but because you knew God would vindicate you. Times when you gave out of your lack, and no one applauded. Times when you prayed for someone who had hurt you, and they never even knew. These were your hidden zeets. Hidden obedience is like planting a seed deep in the soil during winter. There is no sign of life above ground, but underneath, roots are forming. People might assume nothing is happening, but heaven knows the roots are the part that will hold the tree when the storms come. Eli would later understand that this single act of quiet generosity became the tipping point in his season. God had been watching the small choices, the consistent faithfulness, the discipline when no one else cared. And when the scales tipped, favor began to pour out. That's the part we often miss. God's timing is rarely about a single grand gesture. It's about 1,000 small yes moments that build trust. When you have proven in secret that your heart is His, He can trust you in public with more. And so I say to you, the acts no one has noticed have not been wasted. The doors you closed to temptation when no one was looking. The honesty you chose when lying was easier. The kindness you extended without repayment. These are the reasons heaven is leaning in your direction right now. Type, "I remain faithful," in the comments, not because the words themselves are magic, but because declaring it marks your own spirit. It's a prophetic act. a reminder to yourself and the unseen world that you are not moved by applause, and your obedience is for God's eyes first. Eli didn't know how close he was to a breakthrough. He simply lived each day as if God's eyes were on him, which they were. And perhaps that's your story too. You don't need to shout it. You don't need to prove it. Just keep saying yes in the secret place, because those are the yeses that change everything. Eli would later look back on those hidden yeses and realize they had been shaping him in ways he couldn't see at the time. Each one had been chiseling away pride, softening his heart, and sharpening his discernment. Obedience in public is often fueled by inspiration, but obedience in private is sustained by devotion. It's not about being moved in the moment, it's about being anchored in the truth. Even when no one else is watching, there were days Eli's obedience felt pointless, like throwing pebbles into a deep well and never hearing them hit the bottom. But every pebble mattered. Each act of faith in secret was like adding a brick to a foundation. And when God finally built on it, the structure could stand without crumbling. Sometimes, your most powerful prayers are the ones whispered when your voice is shaking. Your greatest offerings are the ones that cost you comfort, not just convenience. Your most significant victories are the ones you win when no one even knows you are fighting. That's why hidden obedience is never truly hidden. It might be unseen by people, but it echoes in heaven's courts. And when the time comes, the echo becomes a sound on earth, an open door, a sudden shift, a divine yes that tells you all those private moments were worth it. When you refuse to curse him, it's one thing to praise God in the sunlight, but another entirely to keep his name clean on your lips when the sky turns black. There are seasons when pain becomes so sharp, so unrelenting, that words of bitterness feel justified. When friends betray you, when the prayers you've prayed for years remain unanswered, when life seems to mock the very promises you've clung to, it is in those moments that heaven listens most closely to what leaves your mouth. Eli knew this kind of moment too well. The year his father died unexpectedly, everything else seemed to collapse in sequence. Work opportunities dried up, relationships fractured, his health faltered. People who had once leaned on his faith now avoided him, as if his troubles might somehow be contagious. Alone in his small apartment, staring at an unpaid stack of bills, he felt the temptation rise, not just to question God, but to speak against him. It wasn't a shout of rebellion he heard in his mind, but a whisper, "Has he really been good to you?" It was the same question whispered in Eden, the same ancient lie in a new disguise. But something in Eli's spirit pushed back. He remembered stories from the old scrolls of a man named Job who lost everything, yet refused to let his grief poison his tongue. Job had every reason to curse God, but instead he said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That memory anchored Eli in the storm, as was spoken in the book of Nahum, chapter 1, verse 7. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. No, refusing to curse God is not denial, it is defiance against darkness. It is standing in the rubble of what you hoped for and still saying, "You are good." That declaration does not erase the loss, but it refuses to let loss redefine who God is. Eli began to practice this defiance in the simplest ways. In the morning, before touching his phone or checking his email, he would whisper, "Thank you for giving me breath." When anxiety threatened to take over in the afternoon, he would say aloud, "I trust you." Even now, these weren't long sermons, just small sparks that kept his faith from going cold. What Eli didn't realize at the time was that heaven measures faith not only in victories but in restraint. There is a strength in silence when silence honors God. There is power in choosing your words so they do not partner with the enemy's accusations. Each time Eli blessed the Lord in private pain, it was like slamming a door in the face of the accuser. This restraint is costly. To bless God in your darkest hour is to hand him the last fragments of your trust. It is to say, "I don't understand you, but I will not turn on you." And this choice, made again and again, becomes a weapon more potent than any eloquent prayer. Eli's life did not turn around overnight. There were still unpaid bills. There were still lonely evenings. But his mouth became a gate that no bitterness could pass through. And in time, the weight of his worship began to outweigh the weight of his grief. You might have had your own moments, times when the easiest path would have been to let anger run unchecked, to say something you could never take back, and yet you held your tongue, or you replaced complaint with praise. Those moments matter more than you know. They are the unseen victories that make hell nervous and make heaven sing. Refusing to curse him in the valley is like keeping a lantern lit during a long night. The wind will try to snuff it out. The darkness will press in. But if you shield it, even with trembling hands, that light will be enough to guide you to dawn. And when dawn comes, you will find that the very act of protecting the flame has made your hands stronger, steadier, ready to carry it into new territory. Eli once said to himself, "I won't let my pain preach a false gospel about my God." And that conviction became his guardrail. It's not that he never cried out or never asked why. It's that he chose to aim his questions upward instead of turning them into accusations. In the end, what you refuse to say can be just as defining as what you choose to speak. And when heaven changes its mind about you, often it's because you have proven that your worship is not conditional on your circumstances. The storm revealed that your loyalty was not for sale, breaking cycles that bound generations. Every family has patterns. Some are blessings passed from one generation to the next, songs, recipes, values. Others are invisible, chains, habits, mindsets. Sins that travel silently through the bloodline, wearing different faces but carrying the same poison. You may not even notice them at first, until one day you find yourself reacting the same way your parents did, or facing the same kinds of brokenness they faced. Eli discovered this truth in a hard way. He had grown up watching arguments in his home escalate into silence that lasted for weeks. Forgiveness was a foreign language. Pride was the common tongue. He told himself he would be different. But when conflict came into his own adult life, he felt the old chain tighten around his wrists. Anger came easily. Reconciliation did not. That was when he realized he wasn't just fighting his own battles. He was fighting battles that had started long before he was born. Breaking generational cycles is never just about self-improvement. It is spiritual warfare. You are contending with patterns that have been reinforced over decades, sometimes centuries. And yet, the very fact that you feel the weight of them is proof that you have been chosen to confront them. Heaven speaks clearly through the words of the prophet Hosea. Chapter 6, verse 3. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. When Eli understood this, he began to pray differently. Instead of only asking God to fix situations, he asked him to change the roots. He fasted for habits he didn't even fully understand yet. He wrote down every destructive pattern he could trace in his family history: divorce, financial instability, silence instead of reconciliation, and laid them before God like broken chains at the altar. It wasn't easy. There were days when it felt like nothing was changing, when his own reactions betrayed him, but over time, he noticed small shifts. He apologized quicker. He spoke softer. He paused before making decisions that could trap him in the same cycles he was fighting to end. These weren't just personality changes, they were spiritual victories. You may be in the middle of your own battle against these hidden chains. Maybe it's the way anger has been normalized in your family. Maybe it's fear, or addiction, or a poverty mindset. Maybe it's silence when there should be truth. Whatever it is, know this: when you resist it, you are not only fighting for yourself, you are fighting for every generation that will come after you. Breaking cycles means you will be misunderstood. People who are comfortable in the chain will tell you it's not a chain at all. Some will resist your changes because it makes them confront their own. That's why you must decide whose voice matters more, God's or the chorus of the comfortable. Eli held onto one image during his fight: a wall with a single missing brick, and his own hands placing a new one into the gap. It was slow, meticulous work, but each stone mattered. One day, he realized the hole was gone. The breach had been repaired, and with it, the cycle had lost its power. If you're hearing this and something in you says, "That's me," then let this be your confirmation. Heaven has seen your fight. The prayers you've prayed in your car, in your kitchen, in your bed at night, they have been heard. And every small act of resistance is counted. And if this message is stirring something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this message as a declaration that you are not content to live under the same chains. Share it so that someone else in your family line might realize they too can be free. Subscribe if you want to keep receiving words that strengthen your fight. And if you feel led, sow into this work, because messages like these don't just stay on screens, they ripple through generations. Eli never imagined he would be the one in his family to change the story. But now, years later, he can see the fruit. Conversations that would have ended in silence end with prayer. Choices that once led to regret lead to restoration. His children will inherit battles. Yes, but they will not inherit his chains. This is what happens when heaven changes its mind about you. You become the repairer of breaches you didn't create, but were born to close. You become the one who plants trees, whose shade you may never sit under, and long after your name is forgotten on earth. The freedom you fought for will still be speaking. Your yes in the valley of shadows. Saying yes to God on the mountain is easy. The air is clear. The view is wide. And the path ahead seems certain. But valleys are different. Valleys are where shadows stretch long, where every step feels heavy, where the silence of heaven can feel louder than any thunder. And yet, it is in those shadowed places that your yes carries the most weight. Eli had his valley season after the loss of a lifelong dream. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion, months of effort that seemed to lead nowhere. Doors that kept closing, no matter how hard he knocked. People told him it was time to give up, to be realistic. But deep down he felt a whisper, stay. Saying yes, in the valley, is not about pretending the darkness doesn't exist. It's about trusting that the shepherd walks beside you, even when you can't see his face. Eli learned that his yes didn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it was as simple as showing up to pray when he didn't feel like it, reading scripture when it felt like ink on paper instead of life, or helping someone else while his own needs were unmet. It was declared in the book of Job, chapter 23, verse 10, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." Your valley might look different: an illness, a financial strain, a broken relationship, but the principle is the same. A yes in the valley isn't just a personal choice. It's a prophetic statement that darkness will not dictate your obedience. Eli began to view his valley not as a prison, but as a proving ground. Just like a soldier trains with heavy packs to build endurance for the battlefield, the weight of the valley was preparing him for the heights to come. Every step was resistance training for his faith, and something began to shift. Not in his circumstances, not yet, but in him. Fear lost its grip. Doup's voice got quieté. Even his prayers changed. Instead of asking only for the valley to end, he began to ask, "What do you want me to learn here?" That question opened doors. Not literal doors at first, but the kind of doors in the soul that let light in. The longer he stayed faithful in the valley, the more heaven trusted him with deeper assignments. One day, the valley would end, but the character built there would remain forever. This is why your yes matters right now. Because saying yes in the shadows is an investment in a future you can't yet see. It's a seed that grows roots in the dark before it ever pushes through the soil into the light. I want to challenge you to mark this moment. If you are still in your valley, but have chosen to say yes anyway, type the number 46 in the comments. It's a reference to Isaiah 46, where God reminds his people that he will carry them from the beginning to the end. Let that number be your flag in the ground, your public sign that you are not backing down. And understand, typing it is not for me, it's for you. It's the act of planting your own marker stone in the riverbed of this season, so that one day, when you look back, you'll remember the exact point where you decided to keep walking. Eli would later say that the valley became the most intimate season of his life with God, not because it was comfortable, but because he had nowhere else to turn. He learned the sound of God's voice in the dark, the warmth of his presence when the world felt cold. And when the valley ended, he walked out, not just with answered prayers, but with a deeper knowing of the one who had walked with him all along. So, if you are still here, still saying yes, even when shadows surround you, know this: heaven hears it, values it, and will reward it. Your valley is not wasted, and your yes here will echo louder in eternity than any shout from the mountaintop. Because when you choose obedience in the dark, you are striking matches in places others have called hopeless. One flame may not light the whole valley, but it can guide your next step, and step by step, the light grows, until one day, you look around and realize the valley is no longer a place of fear, it's a place of testimony. You learned the language of surrender. There is a difference between being defeated and surrendering. Defeat strips something from you against your will. Surrender is what you lay down willingly. Even if every part of your flesh screams to hold on, it is a choice, not a collapse. And it is a language, the kind that is not spoken with the lips, but with the posture of the heart. Eli had spent most of his life fighting for control. If a plan fell apart, he made another. If someone disappointed him, he found a way to work around them. The thought of waiting on God's timing felt like standing still on a battlefield while the enemy advanced. But control is a heavy sword, and carrying it too long begins to wound the one who holds it. His lesson in surrender came during a season when every escape route closed. Job applications went unanswered. Relationships hit dead ends. His health required rest he didn't want to take. There was no path forward that didn't involve letting go of something he thought he couldn't live without. That's when surrender moved from theory to necessity. The prophet Zephaniah proclaimed in chapter 3, verse 17, "The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you." Those words, first prayed in a garden, became the anthem of Eli's nights. He learned that surrender doesn't mean silence. It means honest conversation with God that ends in trust. Sometimes he cried through the words. Sometimes he whispered them through clenched teeth. But the act of speaking them shifted something in him. Surrender is a strange teacher. It strips away illusions you didn't know you were carrying. It forces you to admit that even your best strategies can't outthink the plans of heaven. And slowly, surrender begins to feel less like losing and more like being carried. For Eli, this shift looked like releasing timelines he had clung to. It meant admitting that his worth was not tied to his productivity. It meant resting without guilt, forgiving without demanding repayment, and choosing to bless others even when he had little left to give. It also meant embracing stillness. At first, stillness felt like abandonment, but over time, it became a sanctuary, like a riverbed that looks empty in the dry season, yet beneath the surface, water still runs slow, unseen, but enough to sustain life. There were moments when surrender was tested. Opportunities came that looked good, but carried a cost to his spirit. In the past, he would have seized them out of fear of missing out. Now, he could let them pass, trusting that what God withheld was as important as what he gave. The language of surrender is learned in repetition. Each time you release your grip, you grow more fluent, and in that fluency, there is a freedom you can't know while clinging to control. The unknown stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like a space where God can surprise you. Eli began to notice that in surrender, his prayers changed. They were less about asking God to bless his plans, and more about asking to be placed inside God's. There was less bargaining, more listening, and in the quiet, direction began to emerge, not as a full map, but as the next step illuminated in front of him. Sometimes, the greatest gift of surrender is clarity. Not clarity about when everything will resolve, but clarity about who you are when you stop wrestling for control. You discover that your value was never in your grip. It was in your identity as one who belongs to him. In hindsight, Eli would say, surrender didn't make his life easier, but it made his heart lighter. And in that lightness, he found the capacity to carry joy again. Even in uncertainty, he could stand in the middle of unanswered questions and still feel steady, because the outcome was no longer his burden to bear alone. Surrender is not a one-time act. It's a language you will speak for the rest of your life. And like any language, the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. One day you realize it's not just something you say in desperate moments, it's the way you live. Because when you finally stop gripping the reins so tightly, your hands become free to receive what God has been trying to give you all along. And often, it is only in the moment of release that you realize you were never safer than when you let Him steer. You carried others when you were empty. There is a certain kind of strength that doesn't come from abundance, but from choosing to give when there is nothing left to spare. The world often applauds generosity when it flows from excess. But heaven takes special notice when kindness flows from scarcity. It is in those moments that giving becomes more than charity, it becomes worship. Eli had reached one of his lowest points financially and emotionally. His pantry was nearly bare. His phone was filled with unanswered messages from creditors, and his mind was heavy from days without real rest. Yet one afternoon, a friend called in tears. She had just lost her job, and the despair in her voice was unmistakable. Eli's first instinct was to say, "I can't right now." But instead, he invited her over, brewed the last of his tea, and listened. That day, Eli didn't have solutions. He didn't have extra money to offer or grand promises to make. All he had was presence. And yet, in the quiet of that kitchen, something holy happened. The friend's tears slowed. Her shoulders eased. When she left, she said, "I feel lighter." It struck Eli that sometimes the gift isn't fixing someone's problem, it's carrying part of their burden, even for a short while. As the Apostle Peter wrote in his first letter, chapter 5, verse 10, "And the God of all grace will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." Oh, carrying others when you are empty is costly. It means pouring from a cup that feels bone dry, trusting that God will refill it in ways you can't yet see. It means putting aside your own storm long enough to shelter someone else from theirs. Eli began to see these moments as invitations rather than interruptions. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being available, about saying, "Even in my lack, I can still be a vessel." And strangely, each time he did, something happened inside him. The weight he carried seemed to shift. It didn't disappear, but it felt shared, as if, in the act of holding someone else's load, God's hand reached out to hold both. There were other times when he gave not from his wallet, but from his time, his encouragement, his prayer. Once, he stayed up all night, talking a friend through a crisis, even though he had an early morning appointment. Another time, he slipped an anonymous note under a neighbor's door with words of hope he himself needed to hear. These acts were small in the world's eyes, but they were treasures in heaven's. This kind of giving shapes you. It trains your eyes to see need, even when it's hidden behind polite smiles. It softens your heart to be interruptible. And perhaps most profoundly, it rewires your definition of abundance. You stop measuring abundance only by what you hold, and start measuring it by what you can release. Eli once reflected on the story of the widow in Zarephath, the woman who gave the last of her flour and oil to the prophet Elijah. She didn't give from surplus, she gave from survival. And yet, her jar never ran dry. Eli realized that God often uses the act of giving in scarcity as the doorway to provision. Carrying others while empty also teaches humility. You learn quickly that you cannot do it in your own strength. You become dependent on God's quiet, replenishing the way He sends a timely word. En unexpected encouragement. or even just the strength to take the next step. Sometimes, the person you carry will never know what it cost you to be there for them, and that's okay. The value of the act is not in the recognition it receives, but in the love it reflects. In time, Eli's own needs began to be met. Opportunities came, debts were cleared, and rest returned to his body. But he noticed something. The acts of carrying others in his emptiness had not drained him, they had deepened him. They left marks, not of depletion, but of a greater capacity to love. And perhaps that is one of heaven's mysteries. When you carry someone else's burden, you don't just help them survive their valley, you become stronger for your own. In giving what little you have, you make room for God to pour in more than you imagined. And when you look back, you realize those moments were not detours from your own journey, they were part of it. Every person you carried became a thread woven into your story. A reminder that love is never wasted. Even when it felt like you had nothing, God was multiplying your offering in unseen ways. And in the end, you discover that the greatest abundance you can possess is a heart willing to be poured out, knowing it will always be filled again. Your refusal to bow to lesser thrones. There will always be offers that glitter but are not gold. Some come wrapped in comfort, some in opportunity, some even in the language of blessing, but deep down, you know they are counterfeit crowns. Saying no to these offers is not just a moral decision, it is an act of loyalty to the one who called you. Eli faced such a choice when a lucrative business proposal landed in his lap. On the surface, it seemed perfect enough income to solve his financial struggles, the promise of security for years to come. But the contract required him to compromise values he had held since youth. It wasn't an outright betrayal, but it would have meant placing profit above integrity. The temptation was real. He could already imagine the relief of no longer worrying about bills, the ease of buying what he wanted without counting the cost. But each time he prayed, the same unease returned, as if heaven was whispering, "Don't trade your birthright for a bowl of stew." We find in the Psalms, chapter 16, verse 8, "I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken." Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before the furnace, Eli knew his no could cost him everything in the natural. But he also knew that bowing to a lesser throne would cost him something far greater, his authority in the spirit. Your own lesser thrones might not look like golden statues. They could be shortcuts that bypass God's process. Relationships that soothe your loneliness but erode your faith. Or positions that elevate your status while diminishing your obedience. Refusing them can feel like walking away from everything you've been waiting for. But in truth, you are walking toward what is real. Eli signed no contract that day. Instead, he walked away with empty hands, but a clean spirit. Months later, an unexpected door opened, this time without compromise. It was confirmation that the God who asks you to walk away from something is also capable of giving you better. Your no today is an investment in tomorrow's unshakable yes. And heaven takes note of every crown you refuse because it does not bear his name. If you understand this fight, if you have ever had to say no to what looked good but wasn't God type, no false king, in the comments. Not as a slogan, but as a line drawn in your own spirit. A declaration that you will not bend your knee to anything that demands your worship in exchange for reward. Eli would later say that the peace he felt after walking away was worth more than the profit he had turned down. That peace became his proof that obedience, even when costly, is never a loss in the kingdom. And that's the truth you can carry. Lesser thrones can offer you the world, but only the true king can give you a crown that lasts. What Eli did not realize at first was how his refusal became a ripple. Others who had been watching silently, friends, colleagues, even family, were inspired by his choice. They began to question the compromises they had accepted as normal. His quiet stand became a mirror, reflecting the possibility of living without bending the knee to anything smaller than God. There were still difficult days. He had to wrestle with doubts, wondering if the door he had closed would ever be replaced with another. But each time uncertainty crept in, the peace of that decision returned, steady as an anchor in rough seas. Over time, the no that had once felt like loss became a marker of freedom. Eli learned that saying no to lesser thrones is not just about rejecting bad offers, it's about preserving the space in your heart for the right ones. When your loyalty is uncompromised, you are ready to recognize the king's voice when he calls. And when he places a crown on your head, you will know it came from the only throne worthy of your bow. Eli's stand also taught him patience. There is a sacred waiting that follows a costly no. A season where heaven is aligning what will replace what you surrendered. In that space, trust becomes your daily bread. And when the answer finally comes, it carries a weight you could never have imagined at the moment of decision, a weight that tells you every lesser crown you refused was worth it. Because the one you receive is eternal and unshakable. You wept where others hardened. Tears are not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes they are proof that the heart has stayed alive through seasons designed to kill its softness. The world often celebrates a hardened spirit. Be tough. Don't let it get to you. But heaven treasures the soul that can still feel. Eli's tears came unexpectedly. He had been sitting in the back row of a memorial service for someone he barely knew. A friend of a friend whose life had ended too soon. As the stories unfolded, funny moments, quiet acts of kindness, Eli felt his eyes burn. Before he knew it, tears were running down his face. Not just for the one who was gone, but for the ache of living in a world where loss touches everyone. It would have been easier to shut down, to brush it off and move on. Many around him did just that, exchanging polite goodbyes and heading back to work. But Eli stayed in that pew for a while longer, letting the grief breathe, letting his compassion speak without words. The Word of God declares in the book of Psalms, chapter 34, verse 18, "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Keeping a soft heart in a hard world is costly. It means you will sometimes feel the pain others ignore. You will carry burdens no one asked you to carry. You will see through smiles that are hiding storms. But it also means you are in a position to bring comfort where others bring indifference. Eli's willingness to weep became a bridge for others. Weeks after that service, someone who had noticed his quiet grief came to him in their own time of loss. "You understand?" they said, without explanation. And they were right, he did. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had not walled himself off from sorrow. There is a strange strength in tears. They water the seeds of empathy. They keep you from becoming so self-focused that you cannot see the suffering of others. They remind you that joy is sweeter when it comes, because you have known what it feels like to long for it. Eli began to see his tears as prayers unspoken. wordless petitions that God understood perfectly. Sometimes they came during worship, sometimes in the stillness of the night, sometimes in the middle of a crowded street. Each time, he chose not to hide them, but to let them fall as offerings. Perhaps you, too, have had moments where you could have turned cold, but didn't, where you could have protected yourself by shutting down, but instead, you let yourself feel. Those moments matter. In heaven's economy, a soft heart is worth more than a defended one. If this resonates with you, don't keep it silent. Like this message as a sign you still value tenderness in a world that often rejects it. Share it so someone who feels too soft might realize their compassion is a strength, not a weakness. Subscribe if you want to keep walking with messages that encourage your spirit to stay alive to God's touch. And if you feel stirred to help sustain this work, sow a seed into this ministry, so that more hearts can be strengthened to remain tender in the days ahead. Because every act of support, whether a click, a share, or a seed sown, becomes part of the chain reaction that carries hope farther than one voice ever could. Your small action today might be the very thing that places truth in front of someone at their breaking point. And when a heart that's on the verge of shutting down finds the courage to stay open, heaven takes notice. You are not just engaging with a message, you are helping keep the flame of compassion alive in a generation that desperately needs it. Eli's tears did not make him fragile, they made him resilient. They allowed him to bend instead of break when storms came. They connected him deeply to the heart of God, who himself weeps over his people. And that is the beauty of choosing to feel. You become an extension of divine compassion on earth. You stand as proof that strength and softness are not enemies, but allies, and in a world desperate for comfort, your tears might be the water that keeps someone else's faith alive. And in time, you will see how every tear you refused to hide, every moment you chose to feel instead of harden, has been shaping you into a vessel heaven can trust. For in the kingdom, it is not the stone-hearted who endure, but the tender-hearted who, though wounded, still pour out love. That is the kind of strength the world cannot counterfeit. You guarded the flame in the wind. Faith can be like a candle, steady and bright in calm weather, yet vulnerable when storms rise. The stronger the wind, the more deliberate you must be in shielding the flame. Guarding your faith is not simply about believing when things go well. It is about protecting that light when the air itself feels against you. Eli's wind came in the form of relentless uncertainty. For months, every plan seemed to collapse before it began. He likened it to building a sandcastle too close to the tide, just when he thought it was taking shape. The waves would sweep in and undo it. People he trusted spoke carelessly, and their words felt like cold gusts against a fragile flame. One evening, sitting in the dim light of his apartment, Eli lit an actual candle. It was not for ambience, but as a physical reminder. As the wind from a cracked window flickered its flame, he cupped his hand around it, shielding it until it steadied. That small motion felt like a prophecy over his own life. This is what it means to endure. We are reminded through the writings of Paul in his second letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verse 14. Guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you. Guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit who lives in us. Guarding the flame is an active choice. It means turning away from conversations that fuel doubt. It means refusing to feed bitterness when offense comes. It means setting boundaries to keep out the winds that could smother what God is growing in you. Eli realized that faith is rarely extinguished in a single gust. More often, it fades gradually, dimmed by the constant pressure of small, unnoticed drafts, neglecting prayer for a day, skipping worship because it feels inconvenient, letting discouragement go unchallenged. Guarding the flame meant catching these drafts early, before they could weaken the light. There were moments when his hands grew tired. Shielding the flame was exhausting work, when it seemed the wind would never stop. But even in fatigue, he found ways to protect it, sometimes by surrounding himself with those whose own flames burned strong, sometimes by retreating into solitude to let the spirit breathe fresh life into the embers. The winds never fully ceased. But Eli's flame grew more resilient. What had once been easily shaken began to dance steadily. Even when the air swirled, he learned that guarded flames don't just survive storms, they become brighter because of them. Guarding your faith is not about living in fear of the wind, it's about knowing its reality and deciding it will not have the final say. It is about valuing what God has placed inside you so deeply that you will not leave it exposed to anything that could diminish it. Sometimes guarding the flame looks like refusing to compromise in small things, even when no one would notice. Other times, it means withdrawing for a season so that God can rebuild what's been worn down. In all cases, it is an act of stewardship, treating your faith as a treasure too costly to leave unprotected. Eli came to see that the winds were not always his enemy. Some gusts tested the flame's strength and revealed where his guard was weak. They showed him the difference between guarding out of fear and guarding out of love. Fear makes you hide the light. Love teaches you to shelter it while letting it shine. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson. A guarded flame is not meant to stay hidden forever. Once it has been strengthened in the wind, it is ready to light others. Eli's steady flame began to ignite hope in people who had almost lost their own. Guarding the flame in the wind is not glamorous work. It is quiet, repetitive, often unseen, but in heaven's eyes, every moment you choose to protect your faith is recorded. And when the storm finally passes, the light you carry will testify not just that you believed, but that you valued the gift enough to keep it alive through the fiercest nights. And when the winds finally fade, you will understand why the guarding mattered so much. The flame you kept alive will not only light your own path, it will become a beacon for those still walking in their storms. They will see its steady glow and know that survival is possible, that faith can outlast even the harshest seasons. And in that moment, you will realize the winds did more than threaten you. They trained you. They proved that what God lit in you was never fragile, but forged to withstand and shine all the brighter. Because of the battle, you forgave the unforgivable. Some wounds leave scars, others leave marks, so deep they seem to breathe with you. The memory of them can follow you into every conversation, every quiet moment, every future decision. Forgiveness in such cases feels impossible, not because you haven't tried, but because every fiber of your being says, they don't deserve it. And perhaps they don't. But forgiveness was never about deserving, it's about freedom. Eli's test came from someone he had trusted with everything. This person didn't just disappoint him, they betrayed him in a way that rippled through every corner of his life. Opportunities were lost. Relationships were strained. And sleepless nights became his normal. For months, Eli carried the weight, convinced that holding on to his anger was a form of justice. But anger is a strange chain. It feels like protection. yet it binds you to the very person who hurt you. Eli began to realize that by refusing to forgive, he was letting the offense set the rhythm of his life. The person who had wounded him was not suffering, he was. He, Apostle reminds us in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 32, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." Forgiveness did not come for Eli in one grand moment. It came in layers. First, he chose to release the right to revenge. Then, he began to pray not for reconciliation, but simply for God to deal with that person as he saw fit. Eventually, he could speak their name without the bitterness catching in his throat. People often think forgiveness means the relationship must be restored, but Eli learned that isn't always the case. Forgiveness can coexist with healthy boundaries. It can mean you no longer carry the weight, even if you never again share the same path. The most surprising part came months later. One morning, Eli woke with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The betrayal still existed in the timeline of his life, but it no longer had power over his emotions. It was as if a door had been closed and locked, not to shut someone else out, but to let him walk free. Your own unforgivable might look different. A family wound, a friend's betrayal, a stranger's cruelty, but the prison feels the same. The enemy would love to keep you there, chained to your hurt, convinced that letting go means letting them win. But in reality, forgiveness is the moment you win. Eli began to picture it like setting down a heavy pack after a long, uphill climb. At first, he kept glancing back, half expecting to need it again. But as the distance grew, he realized he didn't miss the weight at all. It's important to remember that forgiveness is not a one-time decision you never revisit. Sometimes the hurt resurfaces, and you must choose again. That's not failure, it's part of the process. Every new choice to forgive is another swing of the hammer against the chain. And here's the truth Eli came to embrace. Forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about remembering differently. The memory may remain, but it no longer bleeds. The wound becomes a scar, visible, but healed. If this is your season to forgive, if there's a name or a face you've been carrying for too long, type the number 70 in the comments. It echoes Peter's question to Jesus about forgiving up to 7 times. And Jesus' reply, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. It's your way of planting a marker in this moment and saying, I choose release. Not because they asked, not because they deserve it, but because you refuse to be chained another day. Eli didn't realize how much forgiveness would change his posture toward the future. Without the weight of resentment, he walked lighter, thought clearer, loved deeper. And when new relationships came into his life, they didn't have to compete with the ghosts of old betrayals. You may not feel ready. Forgiveness rarely comes wrapped in readiness. It comes in obedience. And sometimes, the act of deciding precedes the feeling of freedom. Years later, Eli would look back and see that forgiving the unforgivable was one of the most defining acts of his life. Not because it erased the past, but because it freed his hands to receive the future. And perhaps that's what God is doing with you right now, inviting you to open your hands, to drop the weight you've carried for too long, and to step into a season where your story is no longer defined by what was done to you, but by what He is doing in you. Your worship in the midnight hour. There is a kind of worship that rises naturally in the daylight when prayers have been answered, when hope is visible, when the air is filled with laughter. But there is another kind of worship, one that is far rarer and far more costly. It's the kind that rises in the middle of the night, when nothing has shifted yet, when the chains are still on your hands and feet, and yet you choose to sing. Eli found himself in such a night during a long stretch of loneliness and financial struggle. There were no open doors in sight, and his spirit felt like it was carrying both exhaustion and silence. It was in that midnight of his soul that he remembered the story of Paul and Silas in the prison, how they prayed and sang hymns at midnight, and how the foundations of the prison shook. One night, without waiting for his feelings to catch up, Eli began to sing quietly in his small apartment. There was no music in the background, no crowd to join in, just his voice and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. At first it felt awkward, almost forced, but as he kept singing, his voice began to steady. The words were simple, but they started to fill the space, pushing back the heaviness in the air. It was proclaimed in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 16, verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Eli realized something powerful in that moment. Worship in the midnight hour is not about denying the darkness. It's about declaring that the darkness does not own you. It's the decision to let your voice rise, even when the enemy expects silence. Over the next weeks, he made it a habit. Sometimes the songs came with tears streaming down his face. Other times they came with a defiant joy that seemed to surprise even him. Gradually, the weight he had been carrying began to feel lighter, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his heart had shifted its focus. Midnight worship is often misunderstood. People think it's about getting God to move faster. But Eli discovered it's about aligning your heart with his presence in such a way that the prison, the chains, and the waiting no longer define your reality. In that alignment, you start to see the miracle that the presence itself is before any door swings open. Sometimes the midnight song is a whisper. Sometimes it's a shout. It can be a hymn, a psalm, or simply the repetition of a single phrase. The power isn't in the volume or the melody, it's in the surrender it represents. Eli also learned that midnight worship is contagious. Without realizing it, his private songs began to affect others. A neighbor once mentioned hearing faint singing through the walls during a storm and said it gave her peace. It struck Eli how even unseen, unheard worship can ripple outward. Just as Paul and Silas's songs reached the ears of other prisoners, the beauty of worship in the midnight hour is that it is both a weapon and a shelter. It fights back against despair and at the same time wraps you in the safety of God's presence. It does not require perfect words, only an honest heart, willing to lift them. There is a temptation, when the night feels endless, to stop singing, to wait for the light before letting your voice rise. But Eli's midnight hours taught him that the song is often what brings the dawn closer. Worship shifts the atmosphere in ways you cannot measure, but can always feel. And when the morning finally came, when small breakthroughs began to appear, Eli found that the strength he had in daylight was built in the nights he chose to sing. Midnight worship had trained his heart to trust, to hope, and to rejoice regardless of what his eyes could see. And even after the breakthrough, Eli kept the practice alive. He understood now that midnight worship was not just for desperate seasons, it was for every season. It had become the anchor of his spirit, the rhythm that kept his heart tuned to God's presence. Some nights, he would still rise quietly, not because of trouble, but because of gratitude. The same songs that once held back the darkness now carried him deeper into joy. He realized the midnight hour would always return in some form, and when it did, he would be ready, not as someone caught off guard, but as one who had already learned to sing in the dark. You chose the narrow road again. The narrow road is rarely a single choice made once and for all. It is a decision revisited over and over, often in moments when the wide road is far more appealing. It's the harder path, not because it is less rewarding, but because it demands more of you than convenience ever will. Eli first encountered this road as a young man, in the form of a clear conviction about the kind of life he wanted to live. But over the years, opportunities arose that seemed easier, quicker, and more glamorous paths that promised to get him there faster, without the slow grind of obedience. And each time, he had to choose again: follow the narrow road marked by God's voice, or take the wider one that everyone else seemed to be on. One of the most difficult moments came when Eli was offered a position in a large, influential organization. It was the kind of offer many would pray for: stable income, Sozialprestige, and room for advancement. But as he read through the details, he realized it would require him to participate in practices that conflicted with his convictions. He wrestled for days, pacing the floor of his apartment, weighing the benefits against the compromises. The wide road had never looked so tempting. According to the wisdom in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, verses 26 to 27, give careful thought to the paths for your feet. Do not turn to the right or the left. Keep your foot from evil. No. Eli's eventual no was quiet, no grand announcement, no explanation beyond, "It's not for me." Friends thought he was being too cautious, even foolish. But Eli knew that the narrow road doesn't always look logical to those watching from the outside. Choosing the narrow road again and again shapes you in ways comfort never will. It teaches patience when the wide road offers instant results. It builds trust when the wide road promises self-reliance. And it roots you deeply, so that when storms come, your foundation is not shallow sand, but solid rock. Over time, Eli began to see the pattern. Every time he chose the narrow path, it felt costly at first, but later, it opened doors he hadn't even known existed. These weren't always material rewards. Sometimes they were relationships, peace of mind, or the quiet confidence that comes from living without hidden compromise. The narrow road also forced him to walk slower. While others seemed to sprint ahead on the wide road, Eli had to navigate curves, steep climbs, and uneven ground. It could feel lonely, yet in those slow moments, he found space to listen more closely to God's voice, to notice the small provisions along the way, and to prepare for what lay ahead. There were seasons when Eli stumbled, when the noise of the wide road called louder than the stillness of the narrow one. But each time, he returned, not because the narrow road was comfortable, but because it was right. He learned to recognize that small inner nudge, the one that whispered, "Stay the course." The narrow road is not without beauty. In fact, some of its beauty can only be seen by those willing to walk it. Eli encountered people along the way who were also walking it, kindred spirits who encouraged him, challenged him, and reminded him that only a few find it, is not a discouragement, but an honor. Years later, Eli could look back and see that the narrow road had led him exactly where he needed to be. Not faster, but better. Not without sacrifice, but with joy that the wide road could never have offered. Choosing the narrow road, again, is a declaration, even if unspoken, that you value eternal reward over temporary gain, obedience over applause, and the unseen "well done" of heaven over the visible praise of men. And each time you choose it, the road becomes more familiar, not easier, but more deeply yours. And the more you walk it, the more you realize it's not just about where it leads, but about who you are becoming along the way. The narrow road shapes you into someone who can be trusted with weightier assignments, because you have proven that compromise is not in your vocabulary. One day, when you look back, you will see that every "again" was worth it, and that the narrow road, though costly, was the only road that truly led to life. And perhaps the greatest gift is knowing you didn't just walk it once out of passion, but repeatedly out of conviction. That constancy becomes its own testimony, a quiet, enduring proof that your steps have been guided, guarded, and graced for the journey all along. You fought for promises others abandoned. Some people start the journey with fire in their eyes and confidence in their step until the path gets longer than expected. Delays set in. Obstacles rise. Opposition whispers, maybe it wasn't meant to be. And slowly, hands that once gripped a promise loosen their hold. But you kept holding on. Eli had such a promise. It wasn't vague. It was a clear word spoken to him in prayer years earlier. A calling that burned in his spirit. At first, he pursued it with relentless energy. But as the years passed, progress slowed to a crawl. People who had once encouraged him started asking why he still bothered. Some even suggested that maybe he had misheard God. He could have agreed. Letting go would have been easier. But something deep inside refused. Every time he came close to surrendering the promise, he would remember the voice that had spoken it to him and the peace that had followed. He couldn't throw it away, not because he was stubborn, but because it wasn't his to abandon. As was spoken in the book of Joshua, chapter 14, verse 12, "Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. The Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said." Fighting for a promise is not glamorous. It can feel like tending a seed in barren soil while others are harvesting their fields. It's lonely work. Yet, in that hidden place, something powerful happens. You are being trained to value what others overlook. Eli's fight involved prayer when it felt pointless, obedience when it brought no applause, and persistence when there was no visible progress. He learned that holding on to a promise sometimes means wrestling with your own doubt more than with external resistance. The breakthrough, when it came, wasn't explosive. It was quiet, a door opening after years of silence, an opportunity appearing exactly when he was ready to carry it. In hindsight, Eli saw that the delay had been preparation, shaping him into someone who could steward the fulfillment well. And here's the truth. Promises worth keeping are rarely easy to hold. They will be tested by time, by temptation, and by the weariness of waiting. But those who refuse to let go are the ones who see the harvest. If you've been fighting for a promise, if you've refused to abandon what God placed in your spirit, Like this message as your silent declaration that you're still holding on. Share it so that someone else who's growing weary might find courage to keep fighting. Leave a comment about the promise you're still believing, for it may encourage someone else to stand. Subscribe if you want to keep receiving words that strengthen your faith. And if you feel led, sow into this work so that the message of perseverance reaches others who are in the middle of their wait. Eli's victory was not just that the promise came to pass, it was that he was still the same faithful man when it arrived. The waiting hadn't made him bitter, it had made him steady. And that steadiness became part of the promise's testimony. Your fight may feel long, but it is not in vain. Every prayer, every choice to keep going, every refusal to quit is building a story that will inspire others. And when the fulfillment comes, it will not just be about what you receive, but about who you became in the process. So, keep tending the seed. Keep protecting the vision. The appointed time is not a guess. It's a date already written in heaven's calendar. And when it arrives, you'll know why you were called to hold on when so many others let go. And when it does arrive, the joy will not just be in seeing the promise fulfilled, but in realizing the journey has shaped you into someone you could never have become otherwise. You will stand on the ground you prayed for, remembering the nights of doubt, the days of relentless faith, and the countless times you chose to stay the course. Every tear sown in patience will have become a stream of testimony. Others will look at you and see the evidence that God's word never returns void. And in that moment, you'll understand the fight was never just for the promise. It was for the person you became along the way. And that person refined, unshakable, and faithful will be ready for even greater assignments. Because endurance has now been written into your very spirit. You carried the mantle quietly. Not every calling comes with a spotlight. Some arrive like a whisper in the night. No applause, no announcement, just a sense that you have been entrusted with something sacred. The mantle is not always visible to others, but its weight is real. It shapes how you walk, how you speak, how you choose. Eli didn't set out to carry a mantle. He simply followed God's lead, one quiet yes at a time. But over the years, people began to seek him for wisdom, prayer, and counsel. It wasn't because he had the loudest voice or the most polished presence. It was because there was something steady about him, something unshaken by storms. The mantle didn't make him more important, it made him more responsible. Every decision carried a ripple effect. Words could either strengthen someone's faith or plant seeds of doubt. His private life mattered as much as his public one, because the integrity of the mantle depended on unseen choices. According to what is revealed in the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 19. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. The passing of the cloak was simple in action, but monumental in meaning. Eli thought often about that moment between Elijah and Elisha, how the gesture was more about trust and transfer than status. Carrying the mantle meant accepting both the authority and the humility it required. There were seasons when the weight felt heavy. In moments of weariness, Eli wished he could set it down, live with fewer expectations, or blend back into the crowd. But each time, he sensed the same truth. God had entrusted this to him for a reason. And walking away would mean leaving an assignment unfinished. The mantle is not sustained by talent alone. It is sustained by intimacy with the one who gave it. Eli learned that when the weight felt crushing, it was usually because he had tried to carry it in his own strength. The mantle was never meant to rest on human shoulders alone. It rests best when carried in partnership with heaven. There were also unexpected joys in the mantle. Quiet moments when someone's eyes lit up with understanding because of a word he had spoken. Times when his prayer broke chains he didn't even know existed. Encounters where God's presence was so thick, all he could do was stand in awe. Eli realized that the mantle wasn't about elevating him, it was about equipping him to serve. And the service was often unseen, interceding in prayer for someone who would never know, giving counsel that no one else would hear about, sowing seeds into lives without expecting credit. The world might overlook such work, but heaven records every moment. And the more Eli leaned into that truth, the lighter the weight felt, not because it had changed, but because his heart had learned to carry it with joy. The quiet mantle also required discernment. Not every opportunity was a divine assignment. Not every platform was meant for him. Part of honoring the mantle was knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to wait. And perhaps the most humbling part was knowing that one day he would pass it on. The mantle is never truly ours. It is only entrusted for a season. Eli prayed often that when the time came, he would recognize the person to whom it should be given, and that they would carry it further than he ever could. Until then, he walked steadily, quietly, faithfully. There was no need for grand gestures or loud declarations. The power of the mantle was not in its visibility, but in its faithfulness, and in the stillness of his spirit. Eli knew this was the life he was made for. And as the years passed, he began to see the subtle fruit of carrying it well. People he had prayed for in secret were now walking in freedom. Seeds he had sown without recognition had grown into strong, rooted trees. The mantle had not just shaped his ministry, it had shaped his very soul, teaching him patience, endurance, and the joy of serving without being seen. He understood now that true authority is quiet, and that the loudest impact often comes from the life most hidden in God. He understood now that true authority is quiet, and that the loudest impact often comes from the life most hidden in God. And with that understanding came peace, a deep assurance that even when no one else noticed, heaven always did. The mantle was not a burden after all, but a blessing he was honored to bear. You finished the race set before you. There is a unique strength required for starting, but an even rarer one for finishing. Beginnings hold excitement, promise, and possibility. Finishing require endurance, faithfulness, and a heart that refuses to quit even when every muscle aches. Eli's journey had been marked by both mountaintops and valleys, bursts of clarity and long stretches of waiting. There were seasons when the call felt light in his hands, and others when it felt like a cross on his back. Yet somehow, each day, he kept moving forward, sometimes in leaps, sometimes in shuffling steps, but forward nonetheless. The ancient words recorded in the second letter to Timothy, chapter 4, verse 7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. 11. Eli often thought about those words, especially in the later years. The fight was not always against visible enemies. Sometimes it was against the quiet erosion of hope. the temptation to let weariness dictate his pace. But the race was never about speed. It was about faithfulness to the very end. Finishing required a mindset shift. It wasn't about comparing his progress to others or obsessing over how far he still had to go. It was about waking up each day with the determination to take the next right step, no matter how small. One of the greatest challenges came in his final stretch of ministry. The body that once carried him tirelessly now demanded rest. Tasks that used to take minutes now took hours. But in those limitations, Eli discovered a new kind of strength, the power of passing on what he had learned. He began to pour into others more intentionally, knowing the race he was running would be continued by different feet. Each conversation, each prayer, each moment of encouragement became part of the baton he was handing over. The beauty of finishing well is that it is never a solitary act. Though you run your own lane, the impact of your race touches countless others. Eli saw this clearly in the faces of those whose lives had been changed by his obedience, some directly, others indirectly, all woven into the story by the same faithful God. The finish line didn't arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It came in the quiet recognition that he had given everything he was asked to give. There was no regret for the paths not taken, no bitterness for the sacrifices made, only gratitude for the grace that had carried him. Finishing the race also meant letting go. The call that once defined every decision was now complete in its season. There was freedom in releasing it. Trusting that the same God who had called him at the start was the one who would call others to continue the work. Eli found that the end was not an end at all, but a doorway. On the other side was rest, joy, and the fulfillment of knowing he had done what was required of him. The race was over, but the reward was eternal. And that is the truth for every chosen one. Finishing is not just about crossing the line, it is about crossing it with your heart intact, your faith unbroken, and your love for God deeper than when you began. The applause of heaven may not sound like the cheers of a stadium, but it will echo louder in your spirit than any earthly praise. And when you finally stand before the one who set your race in motion, you will hear the words that make every mile, every wound, every trial worth it. Well done, good and faithful servant. Eli's story closes not in defeat or exhaustion, but in quiet triumph. The race is finished, the faith kept, the fight won, not because he was the strongest, but because he never stopped trusting the one who ran beside him the whole way. And as he took his final steps across that invisible finish line, there was no need to look back in fear or regret. Every detour had been part of the course. Every delay had been preparation. And every loss had been exchanged for something greater. He understood now that the race was never about proving his worth. It was about walking in the worth God had already placed on him. For the chosen ones, finishing is more than reaching the end. It's arriving with hands still open, heart still tender, and eyes still fixed on the one who called you at the start. That is victory in its purest form. That is victory in its purest form. And when the dust of the race settles and eternity unfolds before you, you will know, beyond all doubt, you ran well, you loved well, and you finished exactly as heaven intended. The journey of the chosen one is never by accident. Every valley you've walked, every night you've endured, every tear you've let fall, none of it was wasted. You have seen how God rewrites stories, redeems broken chapters, and transforms scars into testimonies. You've learned that being chosen is not about being flawless, it's about being faithful. You have fought for promises when others let go, guarded your flame in the wind, chosen the narrow road again and again, and finished the race that heaven set before you. That makes you living proof that the God who called you is the God who keeps you. And if these words have stirred something deep within you, like this message, as a way of saying, I am still holding my ground, share it so that others in their own battles may find the courage to press on. Leave a comment about the truth that spoke to your heart. Today, it could be the exact encouragement someone else needs. Subscribe so you won't miss the next word of strength that God is pouring through this space. And if you feel led, sow into this work so that together we can carry these messages of hope to even more hearts around the world. Because this isn't just content, it's a lifeline for someone's spirit. Your action today might be the seed that keeps another chosen one from giving up tomorrow. And when we stand together in obedience, the light spreads further than we can ever imagine. So, take this moment. Stand firm in who you are. The author of your story is still writing, and the next chapter will be even more beautiful than the last.